The next session is a panel discussion 2, Quad, AUKUS, and the Emerging Order in the Indo-Pacific. First, let me introduce the members of the panel. Viewed from the right-hand side, from your side, the Professor Shinichi Kitaoka, Emeritus Professor of the University of Tokyo, Special Advisor to the President of JICA, and Mr. Gary Roughead, retired U.S. Navy Admiral, former Chief of Naval Operations, Distinguished Military Fellow, the Hoover Institution, and Professor Michael J. Green, Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Center, University of Sydney. And the moderator is Professor Yoko Iwama, Professor at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS. Now, at this point in time, I will hand over to Professor Iwama. Please serve as the moderator. Thank you very much. The first session was very insightful, very wonderful. I think we are now seeing the emerging overarching theme coming out of the session 1. In this session, we are going to focus on Quad, AUKUS, and the Emerging Order in the Indo-Pacific. That is the title of this session. For many years, Europe, NATO, and nuclear weapons. These are the issues I have been studying. This is not a major area of study in Japan, but so to some extent, I felt quite lonely. However, for the past 1 year, what has happened? I have become so busy for the past 1 year. So we have a lot of experience if you live long. Now, after the Cold War, the economic globalization continued. That was the basic premise. When it comes to security, we still see regional order in place for many years. But as Professor Matsuda in the previous session said, there was a tipping point somewhere. So regarding security and order, I think we are seeing a arrival of a tipping point. That is my impression. Our awareness and needs and demands and the reality, maybe there is a gap between the two, it seems. So in this session, first of all, we would like to see the current security structure or order in the Indo-Pacific. How do we assess current structure in architecture, and what kind of new challenges we are going to face, and how are we going to address these challenges in terms of security structure and order. So these are the perspectives we would like to maintain. First of all, from the 3 panelists, I would like to receive opening remarks from each of them. First of all, Professor Michael Green, please.
Thank you very, very much, Iwama Sensei. It's so nice to be back in Tokyo after almost 3 years away. It's also very nice flying here from Australia and not having jet lag, a new experience for me. Let me try to frame the discussion with some opening comments about how we should think about these new groupings like the Quad, AUKUS, in the context of the larger evolution of order and institutional architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. And then I want to introduce you to some survey results. The center I run, the U.S. Studies Center, commissioned a large-scale survey of the American, Australian, and Japanese public about economic, diplomatic, and security issues in this region. And I think the results, some of them give you a good sense of what the future of the Quad and AUKUS and other groupings could be in this region. As many of you know, the American approach to institutional architecture in this region throughout the Cold War and even into the early post-Cold War era was very much focused on the bilateral hubs and spokes of our alliances. There are a lot of reasons why this was, but it was a contrast to Europe and NATO, which was a clear collective security arrangement. And in many respects, American strategists viewed proposals for alternatives as designed to undermine the bilateral alliance network. So for example, in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev gave a speech, I remember well because I was studying at Tokyo University, where he called for multilateralism in Asia. Well, he was doing that in part to undermine the US-Japan alliance, to undermine ANZUS, US-Korea alliance. And it was really only in the Clinton administration that the American side began embracing another layer of institutions in this region, what the Pentagon under Joe Nye called overlapping plates of armor, that there wasn't necessarily a contradiction between the multilateral institutions that were developing and the American bilateral alliances that underpin security. And I think going from the 90s into the Bush administration, there was an expectation that the order would be underpinned by a combination of American bilateral alliances, which were the foundation, the superstructure, and increasingly by broader regional groupings, APEC, the East Asia Summit. Even in the Bush administration, when I started in the NSC, the first strategic discussion I remember having with Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was how to build more institutions in Asia. And somewhere along the way, probably around 2015-16, that vision of a broader multilateral set of arrangements to safeguard the region began falling apart. I personally think one turning point was July 2016, when the International Tribunal for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea ruled in favor of the Philippines and against China. And I was actually living in Cambodia that summer, and Cambodia was the chair of ASEAN. And Cambodia blocked an ASEAN statement calling for China to negotiate with the Philippines. And I remember that Hun Sen's spokesman on TV said, China offered us $600 million to help with our election. That's a lot of money. Packed with irony, that whole statement. So it became very clear that within ASEAN, and at the same time within the EU, China was using the consensus-oriented multilateral procedures to actually cripple multilateralism and ultimately threaten the US alliances. And that's when you really started seeing the return of ideas like the Quad and eventually the evolution of AUKUS. So these are groupings that, as John Hamre said, pull together the major democracies, the major economies, the major naval powers in this region to shore up the region against Chinese coercion and revisionism. It is not, as Dr. Hamre said, a collective security arrangement. John Hamre said he didn't think it ever would be. He's not my boss anymore, so I'll say I disagree. I think it could be. I think the lesson of the Quad and AUKUS is that if the challenge to regional order and security increases, governments are willing to network alliances, work together more. And I think that's an important dissuader for China, because AUKUS, the Quad, these things would not have been possible without Chinese coercion. And the lesson of Beijing is the more you push us, the more we will move towards collective security. Obviously, with the economic interdependence with China, it's very different from NATO and the Soviet Union, but it's not impossible. And that's a very important lesson for China. So the polls we did, which we'll be publishing on Tuesday next week, showed the momentum behind groupings like AUKUS and the Quad and our bilateral alliances. In Australia, Japan, and the US, a majority see China as being more harmful to the region than helpful. And that's pretty consistent in the US, Japan, and Australia. Support for alliances, for the US alliance with Australia, Japan, is very strong in all three countries, higher than it's ever been. In this survey, the number of Americans who said our alliance with Japan makes America more secure. Americans have been pro-alliance, but the number who said that the alliance with Japan makes America more secure jumped 20 points to almost 60%. Americans realize we need allies, we need help. And interestingly, we asked about Taiwan contingencies, and in Japan, twice as many respondents said Japan should send military forces to support the US defending Taiwan as it opposed it. In Australia, 3 times as many people said Australian forces should support the US than opposed it. You would not have seen those numbers even a few years ago. I think, as we heard from the previous panel, Ukraine and the coercion from China is huge. But at the same time, 76% of Australians and 58% of Japanese say they want a more independent foreign policy within the Indo-Pacific. And interestingly, 70% of Americans say they want Australia and Japan to do more for their own security. And I think what this points to is that increasingly in a multipolar Asia, the cooperation, the connectivity among Australia, Japan, India is a very, very important part of the strategies for those U.S. allies and partners, and is very good for the U.S. Prime Minister Kishida is in Australia. He's meeting Prime Minister Albanese. They're going to issue a new security declaration. In our survey, 75% of Japanese and 75% of Australians said they would support a formal Australia-Japan security treaty. So this networking has gone from a U.S. hub and spokes to hubs and spokes. And I think that reflects the multipolar dimension of power in this region. And I think it means the U.S. is going to have to listen to allies more. We're going to need allies more, and they'll be talking to each other. And on balance, I think this is a healthy development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I want to invite Professor Kitaoka to speak. Dr. Hamura's speech in the beginning said about there was a change in the Abe administration. The changes are positively assessed, and that has paved the way forward. And that has played an important role. And Mr. Kitaoka played a pivotal role in such a change. How do you see the situation in Indo-Pacific now?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Now, I am a historian, so I would like to look back into history. For free and open Indo-Pacific, it was back in 2016 when Prime Minister Abe has put forward this concept. And before that, the peace and security legislation, even with the big opposition inside Japan, he has passed through the legislation 2015, 2016, as Dr. Green has mentioned. The One Belt, the One Road policy of China that has been peaking, and many countries that have been joining China. So the flow of things have changed, and we have pushed back China with Japan taking the initiative. And one thing that made it success is because it was more realistic. In other words, in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, the development in the post-war period, Japan has supported all those countries. And Japan has deepened our relationship with India from the year 2000 onwards. It has deepened significantly. And the two oceans have come together, confluenced. These two oceans, the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, has been connected strongly because of Japan's involvement. And free and open Indo-Pacific, these are conditions necessary for Japan to further develop. The One Belt, One Road is the challenger, and we are trying to defend ourselves. And that is the reason why we have put forward the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. And this is universal. The freedom of the ocean, navigation, and human rights, universal values, because the concept was supported by all these universal values. It was widely accepted. And even United Kingdom is willing to participate in this free and open Indo-Pacific concept. And this concept has originally put forward by Japan, and the United States in the successive administration have supported this concept. It's now adopted by G7. This is quite unusual success story, if I may say so. But I don't think this is adequate enough, because potential, power, and growth potential of China is so huge. In particular, what is missing, and I would like to point this out, our approach to Southeast Asia. Quad is United States, Australia, Japan, and India. But right at the center, the Southeast Asia, if this is taken away by China, the region will be totally divided. So we need to approach Southeast Asia. Japan, we had trade as well as direct investment and official development aid. We have built very strongly relationship with the Southeast Asian countries, but China's influence is getting bigger and bigger. And this is the chain which is still missing. Mr. Suga, after Prime Minister Abe, for the first time, he chose Southeast Asia for his first visit as a prime minister. So he understood the importance. But then priority has been given to Pacific Island nations. Japan, we have for many, many years continued our support to Pacific Island nations. When I was a president of JICA, I have emphasized this. In cooperation with Australia and New Zealand, we have worked closely to support Pacific Island nations, and more recently, United States has joined, and I am so grateful. What is important about Southeast Asia when we approach them is I am placing emphasis on ASEAN. ASEAN needs to be prioritized, but we need to approach individual countries of Southeast Asia as well, not just ASEAN as a whole, because each country has different circumstances. Looking at how they are responding to Russia's aggression into Ukraine, Philippines is with us. The Vietnam, in their voting against Russia, it is quite lenient, but vis-a-vis China, because of their conflict, Vietnam is also perhaps on our side. But then, the key country is Indonesia. We need to decisively bring Indonesia over to us. Well, Singapore, in terms of strategic thinking, there are many things we share in common. Now, from this year and next year, for Singapore as well, I very much hope that they could join as an observer for Mount Fuji Dialogue. In terms of physical volume, the Chinese trade and investment is overwhelming, but no country would like to become a vassal country subjugated to China. Every country would like to maintain their sovereignty and freedom and security, and we should stay close to those thinking. We need to stand with those countries. Now, what I'm proposing more recently is that what is missing, there are many things missing, but one thing I can say is public intellectuals, the dialogue. Up until now, Japan-US, Japan-UK, Japan-Germany, Japan-France, I had been involved in bilateral dialogue, but with Japan and the ASEAN countries, there are almost none when it comes to dialogue amongst the intellectuals, the public intellectuals. So we would like to establish a community of the public intellectuals in Asia, and we would like to have Australia join us as well. There is no jet lag, time difference. So if we could have such dialogue to be increased in number. Another thing missing. So one thing missing is our approach to Southeast Asia. Another thing missing is our own defense efforts in Japan. Of course, defense budget is now focus of attention. But as was mentioned earlier, the counter-strike capabilities. I have always said that we need to have counter-strike capabilities. For more than 10 years ago, I said that the missile defense in itself is not sufficient enough. When we are attacked, we need to come up with severe counterattack, counter-strike. That is the very basic element of deterrence. And the sustainability and survivability. We have lots of high-quality, high-performance equipments, but we don't have in large volume. So it is not sustainable. It is not survivable. And very expensive aircrafts are on the ground, not even in the hangars. They could be easily attacked. So some things are already being considered and discussed, but what is not being discussed that openly is the intelligence. Several years ago in 2013, the Japanese NSC has been created, but we need to have the intelligence capability to be further enhanced, and we need to have a good vetting process as well. We have been too dependent on United States. We need to scrutinize the reality of the war in Ukraine. We need to grasp more accurately. And with the very precise information provided from the United States to Ukraine, Ukraine has been able to make a counterattack. So we need to focus on this. It is not that expensive in terms of the money. It is much cheaper than other equipments. But when it comes to intelligence institutions, the police and the Minister of Foreign Affairs are always in competition and conflict. So we need to have them work much more effectively. One other point that I would like to add is approach to the other developing countries, the so-called global south. If we look at the developing countries and how they are reacting to Russia and the Ukrainian war, there are many who have distanced themselves from the G7 countries, looking at their voting behavior at the United Nations. Many of the countries of the global south, majority are not voting with us. Because amongst those countries, back in 2003, the United States has invaded Iraq. They are quite cynical that U.S. is in the same ranks as Russia. And many of the global south countries were colonies of Europe, UK and France, particularly. So how can we bring them over to our side? Overwhelmingly, they are in the majority in the United Nations. So we needed to isolate those countries who are violating the UN Charter. In order to make this happen, we need to have those developing countries on board with us. And within the G7 countries, I believe Japan has the best ability to do so. JICA's activities are given very high assessment and reputation. So we need to also reinforce this, and we should go ahead with UN reform. I have been involved several years ago. I had many heated discussions with Dr. Green, how we should reform the United Nations, especially the Security Council. Security Council is almost dead right now. And fortunately, Prime Minister Kishida, when we went to UN General Assembly, in his speech, he has given a statement which is one step forward, that text-based negotiations should be started immediately, is what he has suggested. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this time, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine became a tipping point because the victorious countries of the World War II were the one which built the order that Russia was one of them. However, Russia is now in the other camp. As a result, the United Nations itself is losing credibility. It is being shaken. So in that sense, the UN reform is a very important topic to take up on another occasion. Now, Admiral Roughead, I would like to invite you to make a comment. You have been in the military. You accumulated a long career in the military. And how do you see the war in Ukraine now? Maybe that was a possible scenario. At least for the past 10 years or so, maybe such a war was quite a possible scenario in your view. So from your expert perspective, in this situation, NATO has, from the perspective of the deterrence and prevention of the war, how effective NATO was and what was the lessons learned for the past 1 year. And based on that, NATO, a completely different order exists in Indo-Pacific, different from NATO. And in order to make order in this region functional, what is necessary? Thank you.
Thank you, Iwama Sensei, and thank you to Nikkei for sponsoring this dialogue. It really is a pleasure to be back in Japan after too long a time away. And I think others have mentioned it. And as we think about the future, we have to realize that the ground has shifted markedly. As has been mentioned by a couple of our colleagues, the idea that armed conflict, violent armed conflict between two developed countries was a thing of the past, that has been disabused. And so I think that is back on the table. And I believe the other dimension that we have to keep in mind, in the last 3 years, the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact has changed fundamentally. It has changed the world economically, politically, socially, and technically. And so how we try to think about the future, we can't use the same template as the past, and I think we have to keep that in mind. With regard to the war in Ukraine, and you asked about deterrence, deterrence didn't work. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. The thing that strikes me is, Vladimir Putin is a great martial artist. I think we've all seen him in his martial attire, but he should have listened to that great American boxer, Mike Tyson, when he said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face," and that's what happened to Vladimir Putin when he tried to take Kyiv. And that's when NATO really came on strong. And so even though deterrence failed, the response has been significant. And I think it's important, as you asked, to compare our environment with NATO and Europe. And there are two things that I think we have to take away from what has happened in Europe. One is that there is a very established, very practiced organization of command and control of multinational forces in the form of NATO. It has existed for quite some time, and it has been able to respond, at least in the support to the Ukrainians, because that structure has been in place for a long time, well rehearsed, and it's working well. That does not exist in the Pacific. And I'll have some comments on some recommendations on what I think needs to be done. But the other dimension that we have to keep in mind that is absolutely critical for any crisis or conflict in the Pacific, the supplies and the capacity and capabilities that are flowing into Ukraine are coming across an Atlantic Ocean that has no opposition whatsoever. Free sea lanes of communication, relatively short. You can make a run across the Atlantic, and they're probably making it about 5 or 6 days. And then once you get to Europe, you have very sophisticated transportation networks, intermodal systems that allow you to move things to the border. So you have a very secure logistics base that is essentially Europe. That does not exist in the Pacific. It's 10,500 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean from the the west coast of the United States. And frankly, the only logistics point of any significance is in Japan. And there are a limited number of those. One could also say Singapore is another convenient one, but Singapore is about, if I recall, 1,700 miles to Taiwan. So we have to be realistic about what Europe looks like, the structure, the organization, and then logistics is absolutely key, because we're all aware of just how quickly the equipment and the weapons are being consumed in Ukraine. Now, I do have some thoughts because I've been out in this region for quite some time. And I think that my first recommendation is to the United States. We have to reorganize our operational footprint in the Indo-Pacific. To think that there is one entity that can control military forces across this wide area, the way that China has adapted over the last 25 years, I think is a false assumption. And so I think we have to look at a headquarters structure and an operational structure in Northeast Asia, and one that's in Southeast Asia that also encompasses the Eastern Indian Ocean. And so that we have the opportunity to work in both areas, because I think China would stress us both in the north and in the south, and they would be able to play that quite effectively given how I've seen them evolve their command and control. Clearly, in my view, and I understand the manpower constraints in Japan, but Japan really must develop an operational joint headquarters, not a joint staff office, but an operational headquarters that is controlling forces. And that would be compatible with the US structure and with the Australian structure. Because the speed of conflict today is so fast that those three wheels need to turn in a synchronous way. I would also submit that in Japan, the US and Japan should create a combined headquarters, that we're not passing information and direction from a Japanese entity to a US entity. It's one entity, and that you're able to look at the forces more broadly and control them that way. And then I think the other issue that can come into play is that the relationship between Japan and Korea is vital, and with the U.S. included, because Japan is the only country I can think of that exists in what I would call a nuclear vortex. You have China, you have Russia, and you have Korea. And I think without that integrated approach, U.S., ROK, Japan, that can become a very difficult environment in which to work. The other piece, and this gets to the Quad, and there is some connective tissue. I really do believe that we can't simply talk about the Quad of senior level meetings and conferences, that we have to operationalize the Quad. And I'm a Navy person, so forgive me for leaning into the Navy side, but it's also true that the Indo-Pacific is really a maritime environment. My belief is that to get the Quad moving, we should establish a standing Quad maritime force that's in being all the time. Command of that force would rotate perhaps every 6 months among the Quad countries. That force would operate in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, up in Northeast Asia. It also has the opportunity to be added to with Coast Guards, so you can work down in what I would call the maritime tropical zone, which also is where we need to think more about development and engagement. So this could be a security adjunct to it. And it also helps those countries preserve their maritime resources, which we know China plunders with its significant fishing fleet. So I apologize for rambling on a bit, but those were just some ideas, Iwama Sensei.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. There are several concrete proposals that have been made. Regarding Quad, the other U.S. alliance system is quite different from Quad. There is a very unusual combination. The stance that India takes from the beginning of this war in Ukraine, India has been increasing the import of the crude oil from Russia. Therefore, India is not necessarily integrated with the West or G7 countries. Now, Professor Kitaoka, in Indo-Pacific order, Japan, US, has to engage with India. What is the important point for us to do so?
India has a long tradition of being non-aligned and being neutral. So try to change its position is very difficult. But when there is a trouble in India, whether Japan can go there to help, I don't think so. So I don't think we can expect that India would come to help if something happens in the Northeast Asia. But as India is joining as a friendly nation, that in itself is very good and very positive. So perhaps on economic activities, I very much hope that India will much more work closely with us. And for example, joint production and joint development of weapons with India, and rockets for space is much cheaper if we can join the assets and forms, and they would like to have a joint development with Japan as well. So perhaps more serious joint exercise militarily as well, to ask India to join, and those things in themselves would be quite strong when it comes to deterrence. So one by one, we should accumulate those joint endeavors. Now, back in 2005, when Security Council reform was suggested, UN traditional position as a new permanent member to be welcomed, Japan will be the only one that U.S. can accept. But right now, U.S. have started to say that India is also a possible candidate for that. So let us bring India much closer to us.
Thank you very much, Professor Green. You have moved from Washington to Sydney recently. Now, viewed from Sydney, maybe you see a different picture, particularly regarding Asia. Now, the topics we have been discussing so far, one is, how are we going to bring ASEAN on board? How could we develop a closer relationship with the ASEAN? So ASEAN and also Pacific Island countries, in this regard, could you make a comment? And also, repeatedly, we have been hearing the country name, that is AUKUS, South Korea. Now, regarding South Korea, I give lectures in many places, and I am also asked about the relationship between Japan and Korea, and I am sometimes feel difficult to respond. As Admiral Roughead said, when we consider crisis management in this area of the world, Korea is very important. Could you make a comment regarding the architecture involving Korea as well?
Living in Australia the past few months, so looking at the map upside down from what I'm used to in Washington, two big things really strike me. The first is Australia is situated at the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So this whole Indo-Pacific idea really began in Australia before Abe-san picked it up. And the second thing that really strikes me is, for Australia's security, for many, many decades, the Indian Ocean and then the Pacific Ocean and the South Pacific were secure, and now they're not. They're contested. And, you know, you hear Australians evoking 1941 and 1942 when the Curtin government and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were really worried Japan would cut off Australia. And one of the first and highest priorities for U.S. strategy was to prevent that from happening. And the Battle of the Coral Sea and so forth were the result. Does that mean that India has to be our ally? Does that mean Southeast Asia has to join our side? I don't think so. I think what it means is we need India to be a net exporter of security in the Indian Ocean. That's the most important thing. And I worked on the India relationship in the Bush administration, and we did not think India would become an ally. We wanted India to be strong. And in historical research in the Reagan Library, I found a National Security Council memo from the 1980s where the Reagan administration determined that the rise of India in itself was of great strategic value to the U.S. So I'm not sure how much we should be worrying about India voting with us in the United Nations General Assembly or agreeing with us completely on democracy. I would say the highest priority for the US and for Japan and for Australia is to make sure that India can defend itself in the Himalayan mountains, that it can secure the Indian Ocean. I remember my last week in the Bush administration, I was in a very high-level meeting with a Chinese counterpart who said, Beijing has decided that the alignment of India with the United States and Japan will continue. And there's almost nothing China can do to stop that. It's the force of history. And then he hesitated and said, but it's India, and you will be very frustrated, which sounds about right to me. And so alignment with India, to me, is not as important as India being able to be a net exporter of security in the Indian Ocean, through which, of course, over half of China's fossil fuel imports flow. Southeast Asia, I thought Kitaoka Sensei explained the dynamics very, very well. I think the key word for us in Southeast Asia is resilience. And JICA and JBIC are the most critical organizations in this. We need Southeast Asia and now the Pacific Islands to be resilient. We need them to be resilient against COVID, so the Quad produced 1 billion vaccines. We need them to be resilient against climate change. Anything that makes them porous and vulnerable to penetration by China. And that includes, we need them to be resilient in terms of governance and democracy. Because if we're providing good infrastructure financing through JBIC or good grant aid through JICA, if the people in the governments in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, can easily be bribed, we'll never make progress. So accountability, transparency, and I feel that the US and Japan in particular are increasingly aligned on these questions. Korea, a few years ago, I was asked to give a talk to the Liberal Democratic Party about Korea, and the next week, Shunkan Bunshun, one of the tabloids, wrote that I was a spy for South Korea, and that my friend Victor Cha was my spy master. So I've been saying this about Korea for a long time. The same thing Gary Roughead said. Of the networking of alliances in this region, the US, Japan, Australia going extremely well. The other one that is as critical, and in Northeast Asia maybe even more critical, is US, Korea, and Japan. And there is some new opportunity with President Yoon and Kishida-san. But I feel that trilateral relationship operationally and diplomatically is far below where it should be. And remember, the Korean Peninsula is the cockpit of Asia. The Korean Peninsula is where most of the major wars in history began. The Imjin War, the Russo-Japanese War, even the roots of the American War with Japan were the Korean Peninsula. And it should be obvious to Japan that keeping South Korea on our side, locking in that relationship, has operational benefits for deterring North Korea, has benefits in terms of cooperating for free and open Indo-Pacific and infrastructure financing and democracy, where Korea has the same view we do. But also geopolitically, it's really important to disabuse Beijing of the idea that they can eventually suck the whole Korean Peninsula back into their orbit. And Jim Steinberg and I and others have engaged in these long-range strategic discussions with our Chinese counterparts, and I'd say most of our Chinese counterparts believe someday a unified Korean peninsula will be pulled into China's orbit. I think that's completely wrong, and as do the vast majority of South Koreans, but we don't want China to think that. We should be really demonstrating that Korea is not China's to take, that when there's unification, it's going to be on the terms of a South Korea, and it's going to be aligned in values and geopolitics with the US and with Japan. So really glad you asked that question. And for the record, I'm not a spy for Korea. I think this is really in Japan's geopolitical interests.
はい、完全に私も
Thank you very much. I completely agree with you. But on the other hand, when it comes to the threat from the North Korea, it is increasing day by day. That is the fact. So I think the Korean people are now focused on Korean Peninsula, and they are now disinterested in the broader regional issue because of North Korea. So in that sense, trilateral discussion is needed more often. I have a question to Admiral Roughead. In the beginning, the deterrence failed, you said. So that's because the Russia's attack against Ukraine, that was not prevented, that wasn't stopped. So I think that is why you said deterrence failed. But on the other hand, the war would not expand to NATO countries. That has not happened yet. And also, war has not expanded to the use of nuclear weapons so far. So in that sense, at the core deterrence capability of NATO is still functioning, in my view. So now this war in Ukraine, particularly regarding Asia, what is the meaning of this war in terms of the extended deterrence to Asia? From Dr. Hamre, from the beginning, he talked about extended deterrence. From the spring of this year, Japan has been discussing nuclear sharing possibility as well. So, from my perspective, first of all, as Professor Kitaoka said, counter-strike capability is needed so that the conventional force can be strengthened in Japan, and the Japan-US integrated deterrence can be stepped up. Having said that, in the case of NATO, NPG, Nuclear Planning Group, there is such a group in NATO, and that group is talking about the dialogue for deterrence. And in order to increase the credibility of extended deterrence in Asia, and how could we do that? That is one question. And secondly, difference between Asia and Europe. The topology is very different. In the case of Europe, they are land-based countries, and war can be waged on land, and a small-scale, low-yield tactical nuclear weapon can be used. That is a threat we are facing. On the other hand, when you consider crisis in Asia, perhaps anywhere in Asia, in the maritime environment, crisis could escalate. So in this way, the geographical conditions are different. And in terms of deterrence, what kind of implications is there in terms of such a different geographical conditions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that, as far as deterrence goes, my earlier comments also apply, that the knitting together of the planning and the operational structures allows a more coherent view of how operations would proceed, how they might escalate, and what mechanisms there would be for de-escalation. I'm going to take the opportunity here to also say that one of the other areas that would be very, very important is an awareness of what actually is happening in the region over this broad, particularly the maritime space. And that's why I think it's so important to make the investments in the command and control structures that I mentioned, but also in advancing the ability for the US, Japan, and Australia to be able to connect themselves in cyberspace. And this is a problem, I think, that needs to be addressed urgently, because whether it's conventional war or potential escalation to the possible use of nuclear weapons, that information has to flow. And it's easy to focus on the technology you want to have in place, but it's more about the people and the processes of having a compatible and agreed upon security clearance system that allows being able to bring people rapidly into discussions, acceptance of clearance, security clearances among all of the parties involved. So that's kind of in the weeds, but I think it's very important if we want to be able to talk about deterrence and how our countries will work together in the military space. As you said, the environment is very different, and I could argue that it might be easier for China to perhaps use a tactical nuclear weapon at sea. As many of us who have been around for a long time, that was very much part of the Soviet doctrine. And I could see a situation where someone may be more willing to put a nuclear weapon out over the ocean. And so I think the idea of how we think our way through deterrence, I know you have written on this, and I, as a follow-on to some of the things that you've written, I think that it needs to move forward. You have proposed a NATO-Asian process, and I think it's time to move forward, and frankly, the Quad and AUKUS give us a good opportunity to do that. Because if we were to bring Quad and AUKUS in, and then rather than NATO, I would start by bringing France in. That gives you the European nuclear powers, the Asian nuclear powers. It also brings India into a conventional perspective as it looks at China on its land border. And so I think that grouping could begin a dialogue on how do we want to begin this, where are the sensitivities, and what could be an agenda for some good discussions on arms control, both conventional and nuclear. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Admiral Roughead made a reference to my proposal, NATO plus Asia-Pacific 4, IP4, it can be called, and dialogue among them should be institutionalized. Missile defense and air defense and cyber defense and other issues can be discussed in relation to security. Dialogue have to be promoted. That was the suggestion I made, and he made a reference to that. Thank you for that. And we are running short of time. And there are many points we could not discuss, though I wanted to. But I have a question to Professor Kitaoka. Japan in this region, in order for Japan to take a leadership, I think there are many areas where Japan can exercise a leadership. But on the other hand, there is a sense of frustration, no way out in Japan because of the population and others. So such a difficulty can be turned into opportunity. Adversity can be into opportunity. And West Pacific Union is proposed by Professor Kitaoka. When you consider the future of Japan, we cannot find solutions within Japan only. We have to open up our eyes so that we find solutions from this region. And after the COVID-19, and we are reopening the country, and we are now rebuilding relationship with other countries. What needs to be in mind?
Now, there are a lot of homework that Japan needs to work on. Now, Japan and Southeast Asia, in the long term, we are connected in a joint destiny. As China expands and becomes stronger, Japan cannot stay safe, and Southeast Asia can be safe. I don't think that would happen. We are on the same boat, so to speak. So geopolitically, Taiwan is very important. We need to think about this as a principle. 23 million people have chosen their own government and living on the island. Who can crush them? Nobody has a right to crush them. So from geopolitical point of view, if Taiwan becomes part of the PRC, then China will always try to strengthen the ports and harbors on the eastern coast of Taiwan. There is a very deep ocean there. And for Japan, it will be very difficult for us to have a trade at the route southward. So there will be no more free and open Indo-Pacific when Taiwan belongs to China. If I am with China, I will build a deep sea port that could accommodate even submarines, for example, or aircraft carriers. Now, ROK in the present administration so improved in their relationship and position with Japan. I am so heartened. And vis-a-vis China, it may be difficult, but for South China Sea, ROK has started to take similar position with us. We need to encourage them. The commitments and promise not to be violated, we need to get closer to ROK. Now, there are two more things, minor things that I would like to add. Now, there is often argument about Taiwan contingency. I believe the Taiwan contingency can easily become Japan contingency. But there is a prior consultation mechanism. But prior consultation mechanism have not even discussed yet what form to take. And I don't think nobody has done the necessary homework to prepare for that. And if I may a little bit depart from this, I used to study military history. Now, a member of the military would always want the top-notch, top-class military equipments. But we need to be aware of the fact that Japan is always in the inferior compared to China. So we need to focus on submarines. We could have SLBM mounted on the submarines. We should reinforce a submarine capability. I have said something quite disorganized, but I wanted to add these two things. Thank you.
ございました。
Thank you very much. We have run out of time now, although I had many more questions that I wanted to ask you, but I have to close this session. In 1980s, from the end of 1980s to the beginning of 1990s, I lived in Europe and the integrated Europe. There was an optimism prevailing toward the integrated Europe back then. Going forward in Asia now finally has a lot of middle-class people, and the economy is developing, and the stability is now in place. And therefore, there is an optimism to open up the borders. And I think we should see such an optimism soon. And that is what I want to see in Asia. Thank you very much. Please give a big round of applause to the panel. The members of the panel and moderator, thank you very much. Once again, please give them a big round of applause.